All right. Well, this is okay. Let me tell you something about this, the book of Samuel and this story of David. And I realized it, but um, the the what we're going to study tonight is like chapter 17, and it is David and Goliath. But we have to understand that last week uh, was the part where Samuel anointed David and whatnot. And that chapter is out of order. So it's not going to affect the meaning of the story or anything. But if you're anything like I am, you'll start to thinking, which that wait a minute, how can how can this be? Because uh, Saul may say, well, who is this David? But anyway, just know that it chronologically it's out of order. Why it got like that, nobody knows. So, anyways, here we go. Um, okay, a couple of things first, and um I want to put some information or quotes about the Bible. I've just started doing that at the beginning of these presentations because um, I take for granted sometimes that everybody knows about Dr. Lamsa, where the Bible came from, and that, of course, the way we study the Bible is a whole lot different than what traditionally people do. So I found this. This quote by Dr. Lamsa, and I thought we would read it. Um, when you understand the Gospels from the Aramaic, it is a living gospel and it is a living Bible. Now, the Bible is not a book like the other books of the past, just, books about religions, books from the Babylonians, books, whatever. Um, and those books, of course, talked about a way of life. And the Bible, according to Dr. Lamsa, is a way of life. Now, but the difference is those other books that people live by, the ancient people, Babylonians, other extinct religions and stuff, they have passed away. But this book, the Bible, has been living and will live for many thousand years, as long as the people will even live 1% of it. The Bible will remain. And this was from a talk that Dr. Lamsa gave on the Bible as living literature. So I just thought we would put things in there about the Bible each week so that we could learn a little more. And amazingly enough, I think I don't have the exact statistics, but I think that the Bible has remained on the bestseller list for hundreds of years, or for as long as the bestseller list has been. So Dr. Lamsa had a very deep belief in the Bible, but you have to understand it from the ancient culture uh, of the Near East and whatnot. So, okay. All right. So where we're at is okay. Saul. Okay, Saul is now king, um, and David really has not been anointed yet. Okay, so and they're fighting the Philistines. Um, I just a couple comments about this, and this is me, so don't take a direct quote. But I always have a problem. Well, I have the problem now because I didn't know before. But when they talk about when they talk about, okay, entering the promised land and God gave us this land, I never could understand, and I still don't exactly understand why, if God gave it to them, why they had to fight for it. But, and just, and just looking at this, and I really have started to read some more historical stuff. It's really kind of no different than it is for us, in that, yes, that was the land that God said was theirs, but they had to fight some of the native tribes that were not the Hebrews and take them over in order for them to be in the land. However, that's neither here nor there. That's just one of my comments. And the Philistines were the biggest tribe and the biggest enemy. Okay, so, and we need to mention here that what their government was. Remember, they had judges for a long time for each tribe, but now they have what is called a theocracy, a government by divine guidance or by officials who are regarded as divinely guided. And of course, the way it worked in Israel is that the kings were anointed by prophets, and then the kings received their guidance from the prophets of God, and of course, God communicated directly with the prophets of God, and that's how you'll see in the Old Testament. Of course, that's when you see the prophets. Every king had a prophet, and in this case, right now, Samuel was the prophet to King Saul, who was the first king, and Samuel will be, but not for long, for David, because we learned last week that Samuel anointed David. And one more thing to keep in mind, okay, back then, the government and religion was the same. Okay, there's no separation of state or whatever. Israel, Judaism was the religion and the government, and that's the way it was. Up through Jesus' time and up through the time when the temple was destroyed. So when we're going to be talking about the battle of David and Goliath tonight, and so we need to keep in mind as we read it, and it will say that when David was fighting, he's fighting for both the religion and the government, so to speak, as we understand it. Okay, now I'm going to actually, I tried to see if we could shorten the story of David and Goliath in chapter 17, and I just couldn't figure out a way to take it out. So we will be reading a lot of scripture tonight, and if any of you out there might be in the mood to read, let me know. Anyway, we're starting with chapter 17, the first verses, and so just follow along and put yourself in David's place, I guess. Now the Philistines gathered together their armies for battle and were massed at the border of Judah, and they encamped between the border and Acra and in Ephraisamim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and encamped in valley of Terebinth, and they set the army in array to fight against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on a mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, and the valley was between them. Okay, and remember, Saul is the king of Israel at this point. Okay. And there went out a mighty man from the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. And he had a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. And the weight of his coat of mail was 5,000 shekels of brass, and he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a cuirass of mail between his shoulders. And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam. And his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. And he stood and cried to the armies of Israel and said to them, why have you come out to set your battle in array? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, that he may come out against me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. And the Philistines said, I have defied the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard the words of the Philistine, they were amazed, dismayed, and greatly afraid. Okay, so let's talk about what's going on here, and we'll talk about giants. But first, okay, notice it said a cubit. So a cubit is the ancient unit of measure, okay, and it was based on the distance from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger. Now, and of course, it depended on who the person was as to how accurate the weight was, because it could be a short person and it could be short, whatever. Okay, and then a span was equal to half a cubit, and here it says about 9 inches. So, so they were speaking of a person that had a from the elbow to the finger would have been 18 inches. All right, and then they talk about a shekel, and this is a weight measure, which is about 32 ounces. And they said his armor weighed 600 shekels, which comes out to 1,200 pounds. Now, a couple of things here that I don't have noted, but one of the things, and we're going to see it more, is something called amplification, and it's a literary writing style. Okay, the writers, even today, Near Eastern writers are they don't care about accuracy. They don't care that it might have been exactly 18 inches or whatever. They really don't care. They will exaggerate. And so sometimes you'll see here that you'll see them say, like in this case, when they said he had his 1,200 pounds of the shekels, and 600 shekels of iron. It's it may or may not have been that, but the fact is, this was a giant man. And one of the things I mentioned is, is this, and some people think this is kind of like a myth, or a fairy tale, because it's really, there's some, quote, what we would consider impossible things. But when it comes to the giants themselves, the giants were real, okay? That there's no exaggeration there, except, they may have exaggerated just how big they were, but They were real, and they scared well, anyway, they scared the enemy big time. So many tribes and various people who lived in Canaan had certain powerful men who were known as giants and who defied the armies of their adversaries. These men were extremely tall and powerful. And the reason I say that we know that they're real is because Dr. Lamsa, coming from that region in Kurdistan, that was very remote, there remained a tribe of people of these giants. And so even in the 20th century in the Near East, one could find powerful men who could lift up a heavy burden and place it on the back of a mule. There were two such men in Kushanis, Kurdistan in 1941. They were noted for their strength throughout the land. This is attested to by Dr. Lumsden. Okay. So in biblical days during the wars, victory or defeat was often decided by the triumph or the vanquishing of champions. Before the advent of guns, giants precipitated the battles. And so they many times they would the battle would be fought by just two people, like we're going to see Goliath, and it was the giants who usually went out, and the giants usually won because they were so big and powerful. So Goliath was one of the most distinguished mighty men of his time. He was extremely tall, powerful, and a man of great bulk. He was probably about 7 feet in height and frightening to look upon. His spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. During the time of Saul and David, Goliath was the great giant of his day. He terrified the armies of Israel, but at last was slain by David. Okay, now, all right. Like I said, we might go a little long tonight, but I just couldn't cut out any parts of the story. So, now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem of Judah, whose name was Jesse, and he had 8 sons. And the man was old and advanced in years in the days of Saul. And the 3 older sons of Jesse went and followed Saul to the battle. And their names were Eliab, the firstborn, and next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. And David was the youngest. Now David had returned from Saul and was gone to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near morning and evening and presented himself for 40 days. And Jesse said to David his son, "Take now for your brothers an ephah of parched wheat and 10 loaves of bread, and run to the camp to your brothers. And carry these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000, and inquire into the welfare of your brothers, and bring the news of them to me." Now Saul and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Terebin fighting with the Philistines. And David rose up in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper, and took and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp in the valley which goes up to the battle array, and the army shouted for the battle. Okay, just a couple notes here about this. In those days, the armed forces were neither fed nor clothed by the state. Each soldier was supported by his family, and at times he lived off the land. Soldiers fought to defend their territory, and they considered it an honor to die in battle. Also, the soldiers participated in the spoils and were permitted to take food and other necessities of life by force. Jesse had to supply his sons with provisions. He also sent a few cheeses to the commandant of the army. Just an aside here, talking about that they had to, each family had to support their soldier. In Israel, young people have to serve. It's kind of like the draft in our country, men and women both, and the family has to support them while they are in the army, the military. So that hadn't changed much. Anyway, just an aside. Okay, then Israel and the Philistines put themselves in battle array, army against army. And David put off his provisions by the side of the baggage and ran into the army ranks and came and saluted his brothers. And while he was talking with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spoke the same words. And David heard him. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the mighty man, were afraid and fled from him. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely to defy Israel he has come up. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich him with great riches and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. Now that's Saul trying to find somebody that might fight this man. And David said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills this uncircumcised Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? Now, this is David talking, okay? Remember, David is a young man. Don't know how old, but not very old. For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And this is where we want to talk about the character of David. All right, well, this is where you see David saying, wait, who is defying the armies of the living God? And the people told him the king's promises, saying, so shall it be done to the man who kills him. And here in these verses, we have the old sibling rivalry. The eldest was always the most important, but David was the youngest. And Eliab, his eldest brother, heard him when he spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said to him, why have you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your boldness and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And evidently he was told to stay home. He's too young. Don't go down to the battle. But David says, well, what have I done now? Behold, I was just talking. And he turned from him to the other side and spoke in the same manner. And the people answered him again as they had done before. And when the words which David spoke were reported to Saul, he sent for him, and David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant, me, David, will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a boy, and he has been a man of war from his youth. And David said to Saul, your servant was tending his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear and took a lamb from the flock. And I went out after the lion and smote him and delivered it out of his mouth. And he growled at me, and I caught him by his beard, and I smote him and slew him. Your servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God. Now, when we back up here, we're reminded of the story about in the Gospels about the lost sheep. If you had 100 sheep, and no matter what, if one sheep got lost, that they would go after and they would fight for that one sheep no matter what. And in this case, David went and he rescued the sheep from the mouth of the lion. Okay. And he is at that point, he rescued he slew the lion and the bear, all with God's help. And now he's going to go after Goliath because Goliath has defied the armies of the living God. Okay. David said, moreover, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me out of the hands of the Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. And Saul armed David with his own armor and put a helmet of brass upon his head and armed him with a coat of mail. And understand that Saul was very tall. And I'm not sure that David was that tall, but he put his armor on David. And he took his staff in his hand and chose away. And David girded his sword upon his armor, but he was unwilling to go, for he had not tried them out. So David took them off. He just couldn't work with that armor. And he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones out of the gravel and put them into his shepherd's bag, even into his wallet, and his sling was in his hand. And he drew near to the Philistine. And behold, the Philistine came and drew near to David, and his shield bearer went before him. And just a couple notes here. The 5 stones are symbolic of the 5 books of Moses, which contained the knowledge of God, which David, as a part of a Jewish family back then, had studied. When a Near Easterner utters a true word, the people often say, your utterance is a stone. Okay. And then I was one of my thoughtful moods, and I thought, I did not see any lions when I was in Israel. And there are no lions in Israel now, but they did have lions then. And some, I believe, were from Africa, but they had Asian lions too. Okay. So, and when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy and of a fair countenance. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with a staff? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the fowls of the air and to the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, you come against me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will slay you, and take your head from you, and I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day to the wild beasts of the earth and to the fowls of the air, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will deliver you into our hands. And behold, when the Philistines came and drew near to meet David, David hastened and ran to the battle line to meet the Philistines. And David put his hand in his bag and took thence a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead. And the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and smote the Philistine and slew him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. However, this gets a little gruesome here, but we need to become aware of it now before we go. Therefore, David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and slew him and cut off his head. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Okay. Now, just a couple things here. I don't have notes. I do have some more notes, but when it comes to it's a turnoff in the Old Testament, at least it is for me, when when they're battling and they're killing each other, they would kill whole tribes, men, women, and children, cattle, and all that. And that, I know that bothers it would bother me until I really learned what's going on, but that was the culture of the time. And sometimes a lot of people take it out on David, and say, well, I mean, cut his head off and all that stuff. Well, that is what they did. And remember when we talked about God in their belief system, God was responsible. If they won a battle, God was responsible. If they lost the battle, that's the way it was. And one other thing, okay, in Leviticus, I believe it's 19:18. Okay, we have love your neighbor, and so and of course we know that that's one of Jesus' main commandments. 2 commandments: love God and love your neighbor. But in the Old Testament, in this period of time, love your neighbor meant love the people of the tribes, period. And so when it came time to slew or have war with people outside of their tribes, well, then that was different. And but I might say that that's another thing that Jesus came to change and emphasize, that everybody is your neighbor, not just not just your tribes. But anyway, I just wanted to mention that because it's just important to understand. All right. So, but all right. David was reared in the Hebrew faith. As a boy, he had learned from his teachers of God's victories over Israel's enemies. He heard about Samson who was another one of those giants, by the way, Gideon, and many other valiant men who were fearless in battle. On the other hand, David was a young shepherd who had spent the years of his youth in an outdoor environment. He had been tending his father's sheep just as other young men had to do. During this time, David had become an expert slinger and had strong faith in the God of Israel. In his heart and mind, there was not any doubt, and this made him ready and willing to challenge the uncircumcised Philistine. David triumphed because of his faith in the God of Israel and his strong conviction and belief that he was fighting God's battle. And remember, the government and the religion was the same, and he was fighting for the God of Israel, and it was his strength, his courage, backed by that that innate, unquestionable faith in God, the God of Israel. Then, so thank you for your contributions, very much appreciated. And so we did a little bit of David and Goliath a few months ago, and when we were talking about fear and how to overcome fear, and but what stood out to me with David was that doubt that he had no doubts. There was no rational thinking. Oh, should I do this? Should I not do this? He was just strong, straightforward in his faith, and he had no doubt. So I always like to tie it into something that Jesus said, so that we can maybe get something out of this. And so we go to Mark 11:23. Truly I say to you, whoever should say to this mountain, be moved and fall into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will be done, it will be done to him. So I'm gonna just leave that and hopefully get some thoughts from you guys, because really and truly we are faced with so much baggage and everything. It's difficult for us to maintain that straight on courage, no question and whatnot. But of course, that's what Jesus taught. And so I'll entertain comments about David, Goliath, whatever. And but as Dr. Lumsel always says, every episode in the Bible, there's a lesson to be learned by humankind.